So I'm back. Dr. Ross discussed quite a bit about the ELN guidelines. So I would just touch upon it as to how relevant it is in our clinical scenario with respect to the monitoring of CML and how difficult or how easy it is in some places and how difficult it is in most of the places in limited resource countries. So in order to give you, take you through the understanding of why monitoring should be done, I just go through some of the basics of CML initially. So we have chronic myeloid leukemia. It's a stem cell disorder, as you all know. You have the presence of the PH chromosome, you have the generation of abnormal protein, then you have, which causes proliferation, increase in the total leukocyte count, which gets, which leads to a disease progression if you leave it to the natural history of the disease. And there is a sequestration of the WBCs in the spleen, which results in the massive splenomegaly that most of the patients present with. And this results in a chronic proliferation and the leukocytosis with which the patient presents. And when we discussed yesterday during Pat's session was what is the karyogram or the karyotype. This is what we see when we look at the metaphases of the cell and you call what is known as a chromosomal spread, and this is what is known as a karyogram. And then you look at the presence of the stub-like chromosome, which is the Philadelphia chromosome in this karyogram, and that is pathognomonic of CML. So this is the cartoon which depicts what is exactly the translocation that happens, and you have a part of the chromosome on 9 and 22 coming together, and then you have this this PH chromosome which has got the BCR-ABL activity, which results in the manifestation of CML. So if this is the BCR-ABL protein, and what happens in the pathogenesis of CML is that you have the ATP molecule which binds to an area in the BCR-ABL protein which stimulates the BCR-ABL protein, and you get a signaling which causes a proliferation of the cells. Now, what imatinib does is it goes and lodges in this binding site, preventing the ATP from binding to that area and thereby disrupting the signaling pathway, which results in the loss of signaling. And so because the CML cell or the clone is so dependent upon the BCR-ABL pathway that it cannot proliferate and it undergoes natural apoptosis, and normal hematopoiesis that is there in the body takes over, and that's how you have normalization of the counts. And over a period of time, you have the disappearance of this Philadelphia chromosome, and you have the decline of the BCR-ABL protein, and that's how we do, and that's how we try to monitor. So what happens when imatinib is continuously administered? So there's event 1, and that event 1 is a normalization of the counts. Then there is an event 2, which is the gradual disappearance of the Philadelphia chromosome. And then you have event 3, which is again a gradual decline of the BCR-ABL transcript. It may be gradual, it may be dramatic. And we know that those patients who have a dramatic response tend to do a little better than those who do not. So it is the normalization and the disappearance and the decline that can be monitored. And this is all the essence of monitoring. Why is it important to monitor? We know, and it is important to know that you are responding. It's very important. So you monitor the disease, the response to therapy. Whether you are attaining the defined milestones, whether you are compliant with the medications, it's an indirect way of assessing compliance. Because most of the time when patients have an escalation of the transcript level, most of the time when we ask them, they have not been taking the medications regularly. So, and it is also important to identify the failures or, for that matter, loss of responses, provided you're taking the medications regularly. So why monitor in a certain defined time points? It is never a heterogeneous. There is some order in this way that you monitor CML patients on treatment. And this has not just come out of the blue. It is because there has been an understanding of certain facts that if you were to achieve certain responses within certain defined time frames, then you can, to a certain extent, prognosticate the disease. So the first kind of an indication that if you have a certain amount of response will translate into benefit was, again, way back in 2006, which is a publication by Drucker, who was the, who actually discovered discovered imatinib and did all the initial studies on imatinib, is that if you achieved a 3-log reduction or a complete cytogenetic response, and if this was achieved by 18 months, those patients tend to do better than those patients who did not achieve a response at this time point. This was an early observation. Similarly, Tim Hughes from Adelaide, he also showed for the first time that achievement of a molecular response within a certain time frame, that is at 12 months, distinctly segregated patients who would do well if they achieved that response at that time point as against those who did not. So if you looked at 12 months, those patients who achieved a molecular response at 12 months distinctly fared better than those who did not. Similarly, a more refined understanding was that early molecular responses, this was the publication by Marin in 2012 from the Hammersmith group. For the first time, through a complex mathematical model, they came to a conclusion that if you have a transcript level of about 9.8% as per the international scale, if you were to have something above or below this time, which is 9.84%, they clearly segregated patients who are likely to do well as against those who do not. So this gave us an opportunity to identify early responders and prognosticate their outcomes to a certain extent as against those who did not. And this particular observation was replicated in various other studies, including studies which use second-generation tyrosine kinase inhibitors as first-line therapy. Again, the importance of cytogenetics in a more complex way from the MD Anderson group, which showed that early cytogenetic response and early molecular response did have an impact in terms of outcomes for such patients. So, based on these observations was the designing of the ELN guidelines 2009, where they looked at various time frames at 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and at any time for any sort of loss of response or stable disease. So they categorized it into 3 groups, which was the optimal response, of course, if you were to achieve those responses at 3 months, at 6 months, at 12 months, which is the hematological response, a partial cytogenetic response at 6 months, and a complete cytogenetic response at 12 months. And they included the 18 months also, where at which point they looked at the major molecular responses. And for those who did not achieve these responses at all, they were considered failures. And for those patients who came in between, they called a vague, they called it a suboptimal response, which was a vague entity wherein you did not know which way to go, either to continue the medication or whether to stop medication. So this was the 2009, but it was the beginning of providing some sort of a guideline for treating physicians as to know which track they have to go as far as the treatment of patient is concerned. So we had the failure, which meant that you had to change therapy. You had a suboptimal response where you did not know what to do. You were still having your legs in both the boats. And then you had the optimal response where, of course, it was easy that you could continue the therapy without doubt. So then came the evolution of these aspects of early responders and responders at 12 months and at 6 months. So it was the understanding of these impact of early response in terms of prognosis and the incorporation of this understanding to guide treatment, which is a backbone of formulation of the ELN 2000, published in the European Leukemia Net guidelines published in 2013. There they looked at evaluation time of 3 months at 6 months and at 12 months. And what they looked at was, again, the cytogenetic response and the molecular response. They did away with the responses at 18 months because they felt that that was not robust enough to provide any sort of long-term, data, any prognostication for long-term outcomes. Even though, if you recall some of my previous slides where Professor Hughes had shown that responses at 18 months also segregated patients into different categories. So the focus of the ELN guideline was an earlier, a deeper response. That was the focus. And there was no more 18 months assessment. So what was the emphasis for the ELN 2009 guideline is to whether to change the treatment or not. So they did away with the suboptimal responders. And whenever you had a failure, which was indicated by no hematological response, of course, when you do not have a hematological response, it's a no-brainer that you need to change therapy. If you have more than a major molecular response, major cytogenetic response, or no complete cytogenetic response, or a BCR-ABL transcript of greater than 1% at 12 months, they were all categorized as failure, warranting a change in therapy. So molecular relapses is now defined as a time to change, and also a focus on early detection of resistance as per New Milestone was one of the essence of the ELN 2013. So what do you monitor? You monitor the normalization of the count. That is the first thing you monitor. You monitor the extent of the decline of the Philadelphia chromosome by bone marrow analysis. Then you monitor the decline of the BCR-ABL protein in real time, and you also monitor evolution of mutations when there is loss of response at some point of time. So when you look at this cartoon, you look at, when you have a good responder, you have the rapid decline of the Philadelphia chromosome on this side, and these patients tend to do well. And whereas there is not much of a decline in the chromosome, but certainly a significant proportion which goes down. And in the third category, where the Philadelphia chromosome comes down, but there is also some resistant clones which have emerged over here. And over a period of time, these disappear and the patient continues to do well. But these patients may be those categorized as late responders, and these patients have a proliferation of the naturally, if you have a resistant clone, they will tend to have an advantage and they will progress, and then you have a high risk of progression to accelerated phase of blast crisis in these individuals. So it is always nice to identify who are going to do well and who are not going to do, and that is the basis of monitoring. So these are the slides which were kindly provided by Sue Bamford from Adelaide. I always use it to teach our residents, and these few slides are quite brilliant. So just to make you understand, so as we discussed yesterday in our first session, that we have almost 10 raised to 12 cells at the time of diagnosis. And when we initiate therapy, when it comes to around 10 raised to 10 cells, you seem to achieve a complete cytogenetic response. And this is what is known as the negativity for the PH chromosome. Then as we persist with therapy, because we need to say, you will understand that there is almost 10 raised to 9 cells still present when you have a negative PH chromosome. Then, when you are going to continue with therapy, you tend to achieve some sort of a molecular response with a decline of the BCR-ABL transcript. And when the level comes down to around 10 raised to 9, you tend to achieve what is known as a major molecular response. So when you have achieved a major molecular response, still there is a significant proportion of patients who are harboring the disease still. So even though you have an undetectable major BCR-ABL, which is called a complete molecular response, you still have a significant proportion of patients who might be still having the disease. It is just that your tests cannot detect that as of today. So you have the complete cytogenetic response, you have the major molecular response, and you have the complete molecular response. And these occur over various time frames. The ones that occur quickly is, of course, the cytogenetic response, which you tend to get within the first 6 months. And a good measure of patients do achieve a complete cytogenetic response at the end of 6 months. Then you have, over a long period of about 15 months, to as high as 66 months, the achievement of a major molecular response to a complete molecular response. And this is again a long period of time. And then you have the molecular monitoring is important to actually track this response from a major molecular to the complete molecular response, and that is and this is very important because you need to know that you're responding. So you have the measurement of the range of BCR-ABL mRNA by RQ-PCR, and this is as per the ELN 2009 guidelines. You do the monitoring for hematological monitoring every 15 days during the initial phase, and once you do not achieve that, it is categorized as failure. If you don't achieve it by 3 months, then if you have, by 3 to 6 months, you look at the complete cytogenetic response is confirmed, you call it failure over various periods of time, 3, 6, and 9 months. As I told you, this is as per the 2009 guideline. And then you have a failure, you cease imatinib at that point of time, and you consider a different therapeutic option. So when you look at RQ-PCR at 3 months, until MMR is confirmed, you would consider yourself within a safe haven, and this is the most desirable response, which is a major molecular response, or for that matter, complete molecular response, wherein your chances of progressing from this level is very, very slim. So a stable or improving molecular response at any time is considered an optimal response. So having convinced you regarding monitoring, hopefully, how feasible is it to follow guidelines, and how much is it implementable, and what is the problem in developing countries? So when you look at cytogenetic response evaluation, no doubt it's an important and it's a useful tool, but it requires a bone marrow assessment. There is a lot of reluctance factor. I would say there's a lot of reluctance factor from the physician to tell the patient that please undergo a bone marrow. In my experience, most of the time the patients, if they are talked to, do comply with doing a bone marrow, and they are not so averse to doing it. But of course, you don't do bone marrows every 6 months and every 3 months, but maybe a second bone marrow is always amenable as far as the patient is concerned. But most of the time when you see in clinical practice, the physician, most of the patients have just had their PCR done at baseline, started on therapy, and no monitoring done subsequently. So, so we have the conventional cytogenetics, which is a recommendation. You need, but the problem is you need a certain degree of expertise. You need, it is a labor intensive, and there is a paucity of trained personnel only confined to some of the academic centers. And you have predominantly, there is, as I said, there is a certain sense of apathy among the physicians. So can you replace fish? In India, fish is a very expensive proposition, much more expensive than sometimes RQ-PCR, and it is never a recommendation to do fish. But it is a quick test, and you are able to identify the presence of the BCR-ABL fusion gene by doing a fish test. The disadvantage is it is not specific and may be considered only as a distant alternative to conventional cytogenetics. So what about RQ-PCR? It has evolved as a favored means of monitoring, as I said earlier. It needs a strict standardization procedure to able to interpret results, and the authenticity of the results are heavily reliant on the procedural adherence. So that is why if you are that's why you cannot compare 2 lab reports at any point of time, saying that, okay, I had this report on lab A and this report in lab B, and why is it higher or why is it lower? Unless you do it from the same lab, or that lab has been standardized with a reference lab, wherein you can use the conversion factor to actually determine what the value is, so that we have some degree of authenticity with respect to the reports. So the problem in developing country is that there is a paucity of facilities offering these tests. There is an underutilization of the existing facilities that is also there. There is a large volume of patients which precludes the use of testing this at the recommended intervals. And there is a cost of monitoring at recommended intervals. It is still an expensive test for most patients, even though in academic centers they do take in some of the costs for these tests. So there is a lower incidence of testing contributed by all these factors. The issue of availability, are there any viable solutions? Yeah, effort to establish reference labs are ongoing, and the numbers depend upon the size of the country, and you need to increase or augment the types of facilities in academia, and it may not be a priority, but should be persevered with. And you need to provide the facility in the private sector also, of course, when you do provide these facilities, it should be a viable option, because unless you have tests coming in every day, you may not be able to sustain the technique in any individual lab per se. So there is the issue of underutilization. There is a paucity of trained oncologists and hematologists in a country like India, which is with such high population. Still, enough is never really enough. So there's a poor understanding of the management, because nowadays a disturbing trend is that even the physician who has no inkling about what CML is about just has a superficial knowledge that imatinib works, and they just start them on therapy and they just shut their eyes and have no monitoring about their side effects, what their responses are, how to explain to the patient as to what to expect, and everything is lacking as far as that. So it's a disturbing trend that we see, and as I was talking to Vijay the other day, that we are finding increasing number of patients who are mismanaged who are coming to our center than routine patients or de novo diagnosed CML. Not that we don't do it, but we are having an increased proportion of patients who are mismanaged who are coming to our center. Then there's a non-availability, and one of the biggest mismanagement is the decrease in the dose of the medication. The moment you have a side effect, they tend to reduce the dose, and this is terrible. Yeah. So non-availability of the facility in strategic locations, and the problem of remote areas, the difficulty in transporting samples, if at all, if there is a commitment towards that, to centers, and many a time just the fact that it is so intensive in terms of transporting the sample that many people give up after attempts, one or two attempts initially. So there is a difficulty in transportation of the samples. So the feeling of what we do once you have a bad report, that is a non-availability of other options for treatment for most of the patients, is also another factor as to why to test at all if you're not going to act upon the results that you get. Then there is also the problem of standardization. Why it is important to standardize? Because you need to compare results, and how at least one lab in the country needs to standardize itself as a referral lab so that it can function as a referral lab for locally and standardize other labs subsequently. There is, of course, the problem of volumes. So as Drucker said once, imatinib seems to have increased the prevalence of CML. And there is actually more and more patients who are coming forward to treat. And can we decrease the frequency of testing? Yes, from a practical perspective, we can. We may not be able to follow the ELN guidelines strictly by saying doing it every 3 months, but as Dr. Chang just said, we might be able to even at Tata Hospital, we do it once in 6 months or once in a year, but certainly once in a year. So we consider monitoring at 6 months. That is the minimum that one can look at. And the problem of cost. So we need to increase the testing so that once you increase the volume of these testing, naturally the cost of the test will go down. So that is another strategy. And in conclusion, so I can say that monitoring is an important aspect of CML, and that is the backbone of management of CML, wherein you can make decisions as far as the treatment. It not only tells you how well you're doing, it also tells you how you're going to be placed, say, 5 years or 10 years from now. And there is a need to educate the treating physicians and the patients about the rationale of monitoring, and there is need to establish at least one standardized lab in a region which can subsequently function as a referral lab. The cost of such tests are still high, but can come down with increased use of this testing. And imatinib and other TKIs have proven to be a wonderful way to treat CML, and we need to nurture and guide this therapy by availing appropriate monitoring techniques, and that is how we can have a complete treatment of our CML patients. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hari. And now, if you'd be kind enough to answer some questions from the floor. Any questions? Yes.
In resource-poor countries, would we be able to monitor in some way with the complete blood counts, full blood counts, subsequent to molecular response?
No, it doesn't. The blood counts does not. After the first 3 months of monitoring the blood, it has nothing, no significant value, except if you show a relapse of the disease and you have leukocytosis, etc. So in those circumstances, otherwise it has of little value in terms of monitoring.
Thank you.
Any other question?
Even for that matter, doing cytogenetics after 6 months, because most of the patients do go into complete cytogenetics, but doing cytogenetic analysis after 6 months is of no big benefit. No. Once you have achieved a complete cytogenetic, you have achieved it. That's it. It can't become more sensitive than a complete cytogenetic response.
Question? None? Okay. Professor.
Thanks. Sir, when you are saying that BCR level, when it is undetectable, still that there is 10⁻⁷ cells are present, how you detect that those 10⁻⁷ cells are present?
That is what everybody is working upon. It depends upon the sensitivity of your assay, and current methodologies are only sensitive to pick up that concentration of the cells, up to that concentration of cells, otherwise concentrated BCR-ABL protein. Beyond that, it is not. There are more sensitive, deeper assays which are being designed, but I think the maximum, David, is up to 3.5, is it?
So the most sensitive assay that we've done is just Cas6 log.
A 6 log. Okay.
But that still could leave a million. That still could leave 1 million cells.
Yes.
And the problem, if you try to go further than that, is that then you get false positives,
yeah.
And you don't know if your result is genuine. And also, you need to put very large volumes of blood into your sample. To detect the very last cell, you have to test 5 liters of blood, which leaves none in the patient.
Any other? Yes.
Other than for monitoring of BCR-ABL, would there be any other tests, hematological or biochemical, that we need to see in patients just to assess their progression, not concerning the BCR-ABL? Maybe it's like AST, ALT would be necessary in 2 years' time.
Those only reflect toxicity profiles of induced by the drug. It doesn't reflect responses.
Yes.
At all. No.
So is there a guideline sort of to do that, or is it purely based on symptoms?
No, it's always healthy to do the biochemical profile once in a way. At least we do it at least once in 6 months. Most of the time once in 3 months or once in 4 months, but once in 6 months would be in order. Or if the patient complains about symptoms that might be attributed to some liver dysfunction or something, then we would go ahead and do it. But other than that, it has no value as far as monitoring is concerned. Monitoring of the disease response is concerned.
Okay, doctor, I have a short comment which you may react or not. From previous Rising Suns, we learned that in general, in some countries, for example, Thailand and Taiwan, the relationship between the patient and the doctor is like teacher to student. you would find it hard to question your teacher or your doctor on his recommendations, more specifically when to shift TKIs. Now, we have also learned that some physicians might not be probably aware of the ELN guidelines or the 2013 ELN guidelines. So as patient leaders, I think we should educate ourselves with the ELN guidelines, but on how to discuss this with our doctors is another challenge. Would you like to share it's like a case study, doctor?
Yeah, I think this problem does exist in most of the places in India too. I would say that I think probably the academia is probably a little bit of an exception where we talk about science and we tell them, we sit with them and tell them whenever there is a report which has gone awry, we just try to talk to them about what are the impacts and implications of these reports. And we do talk to them about how to go about it. And we also try to look at what their resources are to be able to get in for this therapy. And we try to help them because there are some programs which also help for second generation tyrosine kinase inhibitors. But I would agree that this is a major problem. And I have many a time had patients whom we referred, who have come to for us for opinion, and we refer back to the parent unit and they would say that we can't even talk to the doctor because he would not we don't feel comfortable about it, and we do not want to question the way he functions, because many a time when the patient comes to me, I would say, why did you stop the medication for any reason? Because generally we have a policy of writing clear instructions and giving a letter to the patient so that when they go to their treating doctor, they have certain guidelines as to when to stop or when to restart and when do you need to give a transfusion or something like that. We give instructions, but we ask them as to why these instructions were not followed, but then they would say that they just followed what the doctor has to say. And we even give our numbers or our email IDs on the letters to them, but we rarely get any communication from them. So there is a huge divide between the academia and what is in real practice in the real world. And I would like to think that the patients who come to us would be quite a few of them actually, and it is never a reflection of what is happening in the society as far as monitoring and the appropriate treatment for CML patients are concerned. There is this, as you rightly said, the student-teacher kind of an attitude, and you never question your doctor, and that may be changing a little bit. There are patients who, I see a trend of patients coming in just one visit to Tata Memorial just to seek an opinion and then going back, at least to know whether they are on track or not, but they are all few and far in between. So it is a major problem, and that is where probably the groups have to come in to be able to guide the patient and have a fora where you can discuss these things. And I think Vijay is doing a great job. And last year she has had this giving emphasis to the more semi-urban and rural areas to talk to the patients so that they become aware of it.
I do not want to extend your time, Doctor, but just one very important question for the Asia Pacific group. In between the 2009 and 2013 ELN guidelines, would you be aware because it's European Leukemia Net, it's basically based, the ELN guidelines basically based on studies for Europeans or for the Caucasians. So would you be aware if Asian demographics for the patients were incorporated in between the 2009 and 2013 ELN guidelines?
No, I don't think, but I think Professor Kim is part of the ELN guidelines, so he represents the Asia Pacific region, and also Professor Hughes. But I personally feel that CML is CML. I don't think there is any difference in terms of the way patient responds or behaves to various. Maybe there is some differences in the side effect profile. And maybe there is some differences in the earlier age group who manifest with CML. Otherwise, in terms of responses, I don't think there is any great differences. And this, I would say, with some conviction, because our data as far as responses are concerned for CML is pretty much on par with what we see in the West. So, so I would think that there is really no need to look differently. That probably the ELN guidelines would not fit into the Asian population, and I think it should be fine to use it unless there is something else which is very dramatic that were to tell us to think differently.
Thank you, Dr. Hari.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hari.